Hello and welcome to Deja View, the Ithacan's weekly review podcast. I'm here with staff writer Aidan Lentz, who was fortunate enough to see an advanced screening of Get Out. All right, you got to tell me what that was like.
It was amazing. So I showed up a half an hour early, and I came into Cornell Cinema, and the line looped up a staircase, back and almost out of the building. It was an entirely full crowd, so loud. It was free, which is the good part. And it was amazing. It was probably, outside of the movie, which is great, it was probably the best movie-going experience of my life.
Was the audience into it? Were they reacting and screaming?
Literally, the audience, every joke, doesn't really matter if it was very good. It would be uproarious laughter. Any sort of racial thing that would come up, there would be like a lot of just noise and agreeing. And when the scares and the thriller elements came in, it was just screams and yells and whoops and hollers. It was literally it was very intense.
You've already said that you liked the movie, but could you go a little bit more into some of your thoughts you had?
Yeah, I think Jordan Peele, who directed it, kind of gave himself a very difficult job coming out of Key and Peele, where he decided that not only is he going to do something that has a lot of comedy elements, he's going to then try and tonally balance it with horror and thriller elements, which I don't know if you're aware, but horror comedies are very hard to pull off in any way that's good. And I think it's so impressive that on his directorial debut, it works very well. It's rare that the comedy gets in the way of the horror and the horror gets in the way of the comedy, and most of it works. It's obviously a very racially charged movie, and I think it works. It basically fires on all cylinders.
Do you see the Key and Peele influence in there?
Yeah, I think maybe not their most popular sketches, but I think if you go and you watch a lot of Key and Peele sketches, you can see it's them. They don't just wear the hat of a genre if they're going into it. They fully commit to whatever genre they're spoofing, and this is very much like that. It's a comedic take, but also a reverent take on horror and thriller, and it's and I think in that way, it's very much like Key and Peele, and the comedy is there, and I think the racial message, which permeates a lot of Key and Peele as a show, also is there. Yeah, if you know that it's Jordan Peele creating it, I don't think it's very surprising once you've watched the movie that it's a Jordan Peele film. I think it feels like a worthy follow-up to Key and Peele, which is a great show.
Does it lean more one way or the other? Because most people are calling this a horror movie, but is it? It's
got a lot of comedy. A lot of the comedy comes from a actor called Lil Rel Howery, who plays the lead's friend named Rod, and he steals every scene that he's in, but he's not in every scene. I would really say it's a pretty even split as far as it goes, and most of the jokes work. It switches between when it feels natural, but it's also a movie that I think doesn't really get scary until its later part, but it's always interesting throughout. But I think especially near the end, the beginning is more dialogue based, and it's still, the message is still permeating through. But it is a bit more on the comedy side with a lot of racial themes seeping in, and then the second half is more on the horror to thriller side, and I think it balances well throughout.
Does it deliver on that horror element?
I think it does, and I think it delivers even better on the thriller element. I don't really want to spoil anything about it, but it was one of the most satisfying movies I've seen in a while. It ends better than most horror movies could ever hope to. And I think it's because it embraces the thriller genre more than horror near the end, which I think is good because horror movies are kind of bad at ending.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but there is definitely a perennial issue with horror movies, and the way they end is a huge part of that.
Yeah.
One of the big reasons that Get Out is receiving so much acclaim and has been written up so heavily is because of that racial message. And I want to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I would say it deals less in just saying outright racism is bad, but it also, I think, addresses an issue permeating through culture I think people don't really talk about, and Jordan Peele really wanted to highlight, which is this desire on the part of white people to it's a thing of we're jealous of you, we objectify them and we think of them in these weird hyper masculine ways, and like a lot of white people like really want to say the N word, but and like love rap music. It's like it's like taking their culture and like co-opting it, and then like being jealous of this thing, despite the fact that we're oppressing them. And it's really kind of diving into this we're both oppressing you, and then also we want to be you type dynamic. And I think I don't want to say how it does that, because that is a spoiler, but I think it's a really interesting way to talk about racism, especially passive racism. As Jordan Peele said, like, when he was writing it, we were living in like a post-racial world, or we were pretending to, where like Barack Obama's president, like there's no racism. So like a lot of the dialogue early on especially is like weird passive racist things where you're like, you don't mean that, but it's still very like, don't say that. Even like the first the message is very much like the first scene of the movie has the song Redbone by Childish Gambino, which the chorus is literally "Stay woke," and that's very much like, and it's very much Jordan Peele saying like, be aware. Like, it's not just outright racism. It's like there is a lot of weird racism happening, and like you should just be aware of it.
And I think the answer to this is pretty clear already, but does the film earn this message? Does it come across as preachy in any way?
I didn't think so. I mean, like, it immediately, all the dialogue, as I said a little bit before, is it's less like out and out like, I don't like you because you're black. At no point does it go like all white people are bad, and like it really, yeah, no, it's ingrained into like the very core of the movie and does it in a very honest way. So yeah, it definitely earns its message.
We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back to talk about social commentary in horror films.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious.
All right, we are back. We just were talking about Get Out, and now we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about social commentary in horror films. So I want to ask you a very broad, very general question, but what scares you?
I would say kind of this feeling of being hunted and almost being, it's like a very on like basic like prehistoric type fear of like being prey. So it's like when you're in your house and all of the lights are off and you're like, there could just be someone standing in the corner. I think that's why when I was younger, Woman in Black like scarred me, because that's the basic concept of it. So I think it's that. I think it's not really ever played off in horror films, but like the fear of like being not welcome, and I think Get Out actually does that really well, of just feeling like you don't belong, which I think is done better in like high school comedies, but that also scares me. And yeah, I think it's generally feeling like small, and like and I think that's generally what horror capitalizes, this feeling of being small and like there's nothing you can do about this larger than life element that's chasing after you.
Looking at yourself as an individual and then stepping back and looking at our society and our culture, what do you think scares our culture?
I think it's this idea. I think if we're talking about the American culture specifically, there's got to be a reason that we spend like twice as much money on our military than anyone else, and I think it's a great fear of I think Americans very unabashedly think of themselves as we're on top, and I think it's then the idea of like people then must actively be going after us, even if that's not the case a lot of the time. And I think we then just anything that doesn't look like us then becomes an other. I think it's and so I think a lot of that then bleeds over to minorities, because I think a lot of people associate culturally America with white people. So then minorities then become villains, and yeah.
Do you see this reflected in any horror movies, any particular ones that come to mind?
I think, as you said, Night of the Living Dead kind of does that. Get Out, which I just watched, really plays on that idea a lot.
I mean, something I've been thinking about, I've been looking at a lot of zombie films lately and thinking about those and how interesting it is that it's about this overwhelming force, and it is about this other, usually, coming after people in a way they feel like they can't control. A lot of times the government breaks down, all these safety nets that surround people sort of collapse and fall away, and you get these baser instincts.
In World War Z, literally piles of them are climbing up a wall, and there's too many of them, so our wall isn't big enough.
Yeah, you look at today, and that really does say something, doesn't it? Oh, God. So we look back and we see all of this subtext in horror, going back to Godzilla in Japan or Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even some of the other major horror films, The Exorcist and things like that. But what horror films today, besides something like Get Out, are able to capitalize on a deeper meaning, are able to convey a deeper meaning?
I think a movie that kind of does it in a modern way that approaches a deeper meaning in an angle that we haven't actually been talking about is It Follows, which really builds on STDs and the teenage community, kind of like the fear that rests within younger people and all that.
Yeah, that was a big one a couple of years ago, and it was one of those films that tried to convey a message like Get Out. Like Get Out, it wasn't preachy, and it had strong characters and strong characterization that is something that, again, people don't think of when they see horror movies, because the mental image that comes to mind when you think horror is Jason Voorhees. And I know there are so many people out there who love Friday the 13th, but at the end of the day, it's this bizarre cultural repression and punishment that punishes people for having sex and doing drugs and being young, basically. And that takes over what horror movies are typically thought of as, even if that isn't actually the case. So what do you think is missing from modern horror movies? What do you think is missing from the rest of the genre, from the Friday the 13th and the Ouijas and the movies like that?
I think I find a lot of horror movies don't play on things that I personally find entirely scary. Poltergeist worked really well when it came out, and I'm not saying it's a bad movie, but it works so well on everyone that goes to college's parents because they're incredibly religious, and that built on religious themes. And I think a lot of horror movies now, like The Purge, which is an example of a movie trying to be grounded, but personally, I'm not afraid of anarchism. I don't think it's going to happen in any significant way in the country, so when that's the theme of the movie, it doesn't scare me. It's not building on like a repressed fear, nor do I think Ouija or any of those movies that's building on a supernatural element. Personally, I feel I feel there's a lot of horror movies that are trying to build on something that, isn't actually that I guess personally as a young person I'm not afraid of. And so like then it doesn't particularly work. When I was younger, I watched Woman in Black, and she was literally killing children, and that was me when I was watching it, so it was horrifying. And so I think there's a certain groundedness to a lot of horror movies that I don't think is particularly prevalent. That then are building off of things that are actually fear you. Like Get Out, when I was watching it, built on this feeling of being excluded, and when I was watching it, it really wants you to know, like, this is how a lot of black people feel all the time. And then that, I think, is a great way for, like, a horror movie to, like, make you feel a message, because, like, oh, that's how that feels, and then some people are constantly living through that. So I think, I think they're building off of essentially, like cheap mud brick, trying to build horror.
They're not earning their message.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now here's another question, and this is also something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because if you've listened to our previous episodes, they're very focused on films with messages and how important it is for films to convey messages. We've talked extensively about La La Land, and our first episode on Split also covered this a little bit. Do you think it's important for a movie to have a message?
Yeah, I don't think every movie is required to be interesting and enjoying. I know personally I liked La La Land a lot on the first viewing and not as much on the second viewing, and I think a lot of that has to do with a certain lack of viewpoint. I think no movie becomes less interesting because it has a viewpoint on life and humanity and existence, I don't think any movie becomes less interesting if it's less diverse. I think a lot of the times, a movie that isn't trying to tell you anything can end up being vapid. I think I like the Marvel movies, but none of them, I think, are really trying to say something. And I think, something does, and so, like, if the action portions or whatever of that movie isn't as good, then it's disposable. There's no purpose to it. I think it's very important for at least a lot of movies, and I think there's almost a certain feeling that if you were to make a movie large, then it shouldn't have a message, and I think that does lead to a lot. I think that's one of many reasons that a lot of larger films become bland.
All right, that's our show for this week, Aidan. If people want to get in touch with you, where can they reach you?
My email is alentz1@ithaca.edu, and my Twitter is alentz98.
All right, thanks for sitting down with me tonight. If you want to reach out to us, you can email your questions to ithacanlifeandculture@gmail.com. For Deja View, I'm Jake Leary. Thank you for listening.